Hi, my name is Miriam Borden, and I am pleased to be awarding the award in the Yiddish category. This year's award goes to Justin Cammy for his translation titled From the Vilna Ghetto to Nuremberg, Memoir and Testimony, which is an account of the life and survival in the face of death and destruction during the Holocaust, in the voice of the preeminent Yiddish poet, Avram Sutzkever. In this artful and thoughtful translation, the first into English, Dr. Justin Cammy brings together multiple registers of Sutzkever's voice at different moments in time. His horrifically vivid, harrowing account of the destruction of the Jews of Vilna, and his sober reportage years later as the only Jewish writer to testify at the Nuremberg trials. We selected this book for the prize in the Yiddish category because of the way Dr. Cammy weaves these elements together as an editor and a translator with a particular focus on the Yiddish of Sutzkever's original. We were blown away by the work as a whole, and it was our immense pleasure to recognize it with this award. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Justin Cammy, who will read an excerpt or two from his book.
Thank you so much, Miriam, for those generous words. I want to thank you and the entire jury of the Canadian Jewish Literary Awards for this honor. It's not often that a book first published in the Soviet Union and in Paris in 1946 gets recognition all these years later. And I think it's even more wonderful on two accounts. One, that up in Canada, they still recognize the importance of Yiddish, and that really touches me. And that they recognize the importance of the scholarly work that translators do. That it's not only technical work, but scholarly work in trying to interpret texts and then bring them to new audiences. So I'm really very touched to have had this work recognized. I know that Sutzkever's family found this very meaningful when I told them, and it's all the more meaningful to have it awarded up in Canada, where I was born, where I was raised, and where I went to college, and where I return so often. So I'm going to read a couple of excerpts, one from the beginning of the book and one from Sutzkever's diary notes of his testimony at Nuremberg. When I turned on the radio the morning of 22 June 1941, a hysterical German scream leapt out at me like a pack of lizards. From the clamor, I realized that the German army had crossed the border. I darted outside, eager for a familiar face. I came across Noach Prilutsky, professor of Yiddish studies at Vilnius University. He was absorbed in his research on Yiddish phonetics. Hitler began to dig his own grave with the first bomb dropped on Russian territory, Prilutsky prophesied. But he had no advice about what we ought to do. He turned back to his work. Firefighters rushed through the streets. A fire was burning next to the Green Bridge. I turned towards Mother's home, which was located just beyond the bridge. She was relieved to see me. She showered me with kisses and tried to assure me that everything would be all right. The bombs fell relentlessly. Across the Vilna River, a gas reservoir was on fire. The smell made it all the way into our little room and tore at our throats. Mom, we have to save ourselves. Mother stroked my hair, kissed my forehead, and with a painful expression I will never forget, told me, I'm not going anywhere, but you are my life. Go and save yourself. You have your entire life ahead of you. I'm going to read an excerpt from Sutzkever's diary entry after his testimony at the Nuremberg trials, dated Wednesday, February 27th, 1946. I've just concluded my testimony before the Nuremberg tribunal. The words are still glowing on my lips, words that I shrieked out before the entire world and for future generations. I was shaken to my very core. It was without question the most powerful experience of my 30-some years of life. I spoke for 38 minutes. It cannot be other than divine providence who put Russian into my mouth. I myself was not certain that I would manage to express my full feelings and memories in that language. It is still difficult for me to take stock of my feelings. Which is stronger, my sorrow or my desire for revenge? It seems to me that greater than either is the radiant, powerful feeling that our people lives, that it has outlived its executioners, and that no dark force can annihilate us. In a Jewish twist of fate, a Yiddish poet, perhaps the only one still alive from the ghettos of Europe, has come to Nuremberg to cast judgment on the Rosenbergs and on the Franks, and in so doing, perhaps also on the surviving remnants of fascism in other countries. This huge responsibility occupied my every brain cell. For 2 nights before my appearance, I couldn't shut my eyes. I saw my mother running naked over a snow-covered field. The warm blood from the bullet wound that pierced her heart trickled onto the floor of my room and encircled me like a ring. So these are only two excerpts from different parts of Sutzkever's From the Vilna Ghetto to Nuremberg.
Thank you so much for that. Really remarkable. So I'd like to ask you a couple of questions to help us understand your role as a translator and the work itself. I guess I'm wondering initially, so what drew you to the work? What drew you to this project? And how did you end up combining, these two sort of separate works, the memoirs of the ghetto and the war, and then his memoirs of Nuremberg?
So I've been working for years on what I like to call When Yiddish Was Young. And that is an opportunity to reframe post-war understandings of Yiddish as weak, as vulnerable, as murdered, as martyred, as the language of older people or aging people. And to help people understand that Yiddish for many centuries was the language of cradle to grave, was the language of Jewish culture in Ashkenaz. And my particular focus was on interwar Vilna, Sutzkever's hometown, and the writers of Jung Vilna, that is the writers of the 1930s, where we see modernist experimentation, political engagement, and all types of other shenanigans that one would expect from a young writers group of late teenagers and people in their early 20s. And that's really how I got interested in Sutzkever to begin with. But it occurred to me that it was rather strange that although we have so much translated of Sutzkever's poetry, it was never decided to translate the only prose memoir he wrote about his time in the Vilna Ghetto. It had been translated into Hebrew, it had been translated into German, it had been translated into other languages, but never into English. And that's how I really got involved in wanting to show sort of this next stage in Sutzkever's career. However, it's a vexed document because it was written not during the war, it was written after the war at the invitation of Ilya Ehrenberg and other members of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee in Moscow, who had a particular agenda in what they wanted from writers who would contribute to the so-called Black Book that was meant to be an indictment of Nazi fascist crimes. So because Sutzkever wrote this in Moscow, or actually between Moscow and Vilna, he was traveling back and forth immediately after the city's liberation. Part of the memoir, it seemed to me, would need to be also take into account the context of those who had invited him to write it and the context in which he found himself in wartime and immediate post-war Moscow. So that's why I combined Sutzkever's memoir, which was published as an independent document, and then also included several other elements. One, his testimony from Nuremberg. Two, his diary entries about the testimony at Nuremberg. And then three essays about Soviet Jewish figures that help us understand the world and contextualize the moment when he wrote this. One is on Ilya Ehrenberg, the great Soviet Russian language writer. Another is on Shlomo Michols, the great Yiddish actor and director. And the other is on Peretz Markish, the great experimental Yiddish modernist poet. And I think by bringing these essays together with the memoir, what we're able to do is to have a document that in a way looks at Sutzkever's very brief, but I think critical Moscow years. That is the period between his rescue from the forests in 1944 and the moment where he eventually leaves Moscow, making his way first to Łódź, then to Paris, and then to Eretz Yisrael. So this allows us to really bring this period together and also to look at Sutzkever as a prose writer and not only as a poet.
I wanted to ask you about that exact thing, that you're intimately familiar with his work as a poet, and I'm wondering to what extent you found his poetic voice in the prose that you were working with.
Well, interestingly, I think one of the reasons that this book hadn't been translated before into English was an assumption among fans of Sutzkever, that Sutzkever was such an accomplished master of language and of poetic form that anything different in a different register would be a diminishment and potentially threaten that reputation. But in reading this text, what I found is that this is an extremely moving, at times restrained, but at times quite expressive document that allows him to write in a different mode and perhaps allows him to work through some of the ideas that had already occurred to him and that would become the basis for poems, or the poems were written before and they became the way that allowed him to reconstitute his memory and to write the memoir. What I think was most fascinating was how little he writes about his own poetry in this memoir, how little he writes about his own work, how little he there are very few citations about his own work. So all of that is in a way a deflection towards the community, towards the collective experience. At the same time, as a literary scholar, I thought, wow, we have this memoir by Sutzkever. We're going to be able to now find out the real details behind some of his most famous poems. We're going to be able to find out the actual information about Die Lehrerin Mira. We're going to be able to find out exactly what happened when we think of the Die Bleine Platten von Roms Druckerei, and so on and so on. What we find is that there's very little information about the context for these poems. And in a way, the truth of the poems is stronger in some cases than the truth of the mention of those particular incidents in the memoir. So it's when he's not necessarily writing about those moments that the memoir really finds its voice and excitement. And I also found it really interesting to read a Sutzkever that also brings in a multiplicity of voices. He quotes a lot of people. So you have not only the memoir of this poet, but you also have the memoir of all of those who were talking to the poet, or with whom the poet was interacting. And many of those find their way into the text as well.
Well, I think it is an extraordinary contribution to both Holocaust literature and to Holocaust testimony. I want to thank you so much for this book and for all of your work and your dedication to it. And congratulations again on this award.
Thank you so very much. It's really been a pleasure talking to you, Miriam.
Likewise.